Bill's story, chapter 1. You know what T-Bone told me? He said, David, go to the first page in the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. I went to page 1. He said, no, first page. Well, that is first page. No, it ain't. And so you've heard it over and over. You know, the first page becomes the first page, which is the blank page. It's not page 1. It's the first page. And I didn't understand that. He helped me to understand that. And so page 1, chapter 1, Bill's story, kicks off like this. War fever ran high in the New England town to which we knew young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned. We were flattered when the first citizens took us into their homes, making us feel heroic. That's dangerous for people like us. Here was love and applause. Oh man, I get in trouble with that. War, moment sublime with intervals hilarious. Yeah, I used to read this story and think, I can't relate to Bill Wilson. He was a New York stock speculator, broker, whatever you want to call it. But I have no trouble identifying with it now when I read sentences like this. I was a part of life at last. Anybody ever drink alcohol or do anything and feel like that? Yeah, every time. In the midst of excitement, I discovered liquor. I forgot the strong warning and prejudice of my people concerning drinking. Time we sailed for over there. Let's look at this sentence and see if we can relate to Bill Wilson. I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. Anybody ever do that? We landed in England and I visited Winchester Cathedral, much moved. Now see, I used to think this meant when he went outside, a lot was going on, cars was flying by. But look at how he words this. Much moved. He's talking about on the inside. Bill had a spiritual experience right here. He did. He said, I wandered outside. This is after much moved on the inside. My attention was caught by the doggerel of an old tombstone. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier is near forgot whether he died by musket or by pot. So a little deeper study into this cathedral experience. One of my friends shared this with me, and I want to share it with you, and this is what Bill had wrote in some of his other writings concerning this cathedral experience that he just briefly touched upon here when he said much moved and I wandered outside. He wrote this. Then we were in dear old England, soon to cross the channel to the great unknown. I stood in the Winchester Cathedral the day before, crossing hand in hand and head bowed, for something had touched me. And that's what he meant right there when he said much moved. That I never had felt before. I had been wondering in a rare moment of sober reflection what sense there could be to killing and carnage of which I was soon to become an enthusiastic part. Where could the deity be? Could there be such a thing? Where now was God, the God of the preachers? The thought of which used to make me so uncomfortable whenever they talked about him. Here I stood on the abyss, edge of the abyss, into which thousands were fallen that very day. A feeling of despair settled down on me. Where was he? Why did he not come? And suddenly in that moment of darkness, he was there. Any of us can relate to that? My worst day in 2019, emotional sobriety found me that day. I've been physically sober for 25 years at that point, studied the book, had a good life, had this, but I had a lot of things going on the inside. And on my darkest day and my darkest hour, he showed up. And that's what happened to Bill here. He said, I felt an all-enveloping, comforting, powerful presence. Tears stood in my eyes as I looked about. I saw on the faces of others nearby that they too had glimpsed the great reality. Much moved. That's what he said there. I walked out into the cathedral yard where I read the following inscription on a tombstone. Here lies the Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier is never forgot whether he dieth by musket or by pot. We're talking about a pot of beer, not a joint. Squadron of bombers swept overhead in the bright sunlight. I cried to myself, here to adventure. The feeling of being in the great presence disappeared, never to return for many years. And as we know, it was many years later, as we're going to see in his story, before that experience ever comes back to him again. And for all of us that have had that spiritual experience like I had with T-Bone in 1995 that changed my life forever, something come back. And I wasn't ready for it. And it found me. It found me in sobriety. And it's, as we get sober, other things begin to compete for our recovery. And if we're not practicing step 10, as we're going to see outlined in this book on a daily basis, and watching for those thoughts, they're going to get us. Bad news about all of that is those things are going to win out. And that's what happened in my life. And it took over for a long, long time. But by the grace of God and the power of God and the sunlight of the Spirit, I found a way out. I found a way out. And I got to recover. It's amazing. So look what he says, bottom of page 1. On this warning, which I failed to heed. 22 and a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. Can anybody relate to this? I fancied myself a leader. I do that a lot, even sober. Had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation. Anybody relate to this? My talent for leadership. I can see nothing but self and ego here. I imagine, key word, look out for that. I imagine would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. I took a night law course and obtained employment as an investor for a surety company, and the drive for success was on. Can anybody relate to this? I'd proved to the world I was important. I have no problem identifying with Bill Wilson. My work took me about Wall Street. Little by little, I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but I came very rich. Look at this, key words. Why not I? Self-pity. That's how I am. Why not me? How come? So let's look over on page 3 and let's go to the middle of the page. Bill says this, for the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. Look at these 3 words. Has anybody as an alcoholic or a sober alcoholic ever felt this way? I had arrived. My judgment to the ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. The drink was taking an important and exhilarating part of my life. We're going to see how the illness, the disease, whatever you want to call it, begins to move in Bill the same way that it did in us. And we're going to see how this takes him all the way to the bottom. And he tries over and over and over to get sober. And he seeks out many spiritual solutions along the way. But he doesn't know what the problem is. His mind tells him he can drink, he drinks, just like we did. Tells him he could do whatever he does, and he does it, same as we did. But when he meets Silkworth, this all changes. And Eddie Thatcher comes to see him. So, bottom paragraph, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing almost all day and every night. The remonstrances, the remonstrance, I ain't even saying that right, but of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. Anybody get to that point in their illness? Guarantee you a bunch of us did, didn't we? There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. I guarantee there was in my house, too. I had an ex-wife. I've had a few of them. They wrote a song one time called Don't Come Home Drinking with Loving on Your Mind, and I think they wrote that about her because she was mean as any man I had ever met. And, man, the things that she done at times when I was drunk was ungodly. I mean, I don't fear hardly no man, but I fear that woman, you know, especially when I was drinking. And so I can relate when he says there's many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity for my wife. For loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. So in some of his earlier writings, Lois talks about, you know, finding him at the door many times with just a suit coat on and nothing else. So I don't know, you know, whenever I read this here, there's been no real infidelity for loyalty to my wife. So he contracts golf fever, but page 4 is where it really begins to start taking him over. Let's go to the middle of the page. The next morning he says, this is after he's lost millions. Everybody did. Abruptly, in October 29, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel to a hotel bar from a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market had closed. The ticker still clattered. Anybody ever sober up the next morning or try to sober up and the ticker still clatter? I know this is talking about something else, but I want to look at this a little deeper than just these words. He says, I was staring at an inch of tape, which bore the inscription XYZ32. It had been 52 that morning. I was finished, and so were me and my friends. The papers reported men jumping to death from the tires of high finance. That disgusted me. I would not jump. So we see that he did the same thing that I would do here. He went back to the bar. So my friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. So what? Tomorrow was another day as I drank. That old fierce determination to win came back. So Bill, the first time we're going to see that he gets sober on fear. And page 5, first full paragraph there. The first paragraph there. I became an unwelcome hanger-on. Here was the golden boy of Wall Street. He had made more money for more people than anybody. I mean, this guy had a talent for fast talking to slow thinking people. He had a way of getting deep in their pockets and getting money out of them. And here was a guy who was so well loved and liked. And now they're telling him, man, don't come around no more. I mean, you smell bad, you're embarrassing us, and I mean, the golden boy is gone. Alcohol has taken that away. And that's exactly what it's done to many of us. And he says, I become an unwelcome hanger-on at the brokerage places. And like, man, go on down the street. He says, liquor ceased to become a luxury. It become a necessity. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3 got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly. And I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler of gin followed by half a dozen bottles of beer would be required if I was to eat any breakfast. Look at how we think. The same way he thinks here is the same way that most of us think. Nevertheless, I still thought, key word, because we're going to see how this thinking is really what the problem is, that I could control the situation. Remember, the doctor said, I cannot differentiate the true from the false. That's exactly what's going on right here. Anytime I think this, now that drinking has been gone for 28 plus years, if I still think that I can control any kind of situation or make an outcome come out the way that I want, then I'm believing a lie. Because I'm not dependent upon the power of God, I'm dependent upon self. As we will see as we move on, self is what the trouble is. He said there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. So Bill sobers up a little bit, for just a little bit. He says, gradually, things got worse. They always do, don't they? Well, then he gets a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point in 1932, and he had somehow formed a group to buy. He was to share generously in the profits. And he goes on a prodigious bender, and the chance vanishes. The story is that he had finally pulled himself together a little bit. The guys had watched him, and they said, they called him in. They said, look, Bill, if you do this deal, we'll give you a chance to come back. How many of us have had that chance? And they said, but you cannot. Now, let me repeat this. You cannot drink. He was like, you don't have to worry about that. Drinking's over. It's done. So he brings in a big deal. They make tons of money. They're all sitting around in a hotel room. They're sitting around in a big circle, kind of like we are here, and they're passing around a jug of Jersey White Lightning. And it comes by Bill, and he says, no thanks. And it goes around, and he comes by again, and he says, no thanks. And it gets back around about over there to where Jeff is, and his mind says, hell, we ain't never drank any Jersey Lightning before. It'd probably be a good idea if we tried some of that. And the bottle's coming on down, and it's talking, and it's like, and all of a sudden he says, to hell with it, that would be a pretty good idea. And he takes a drink, and when he does, he triggers the allergy, and when he triggers the allergy, he's gone. And so he says here, then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. And it definitely did, and it has for most of us. Well, he woke up. This has to be stopped. And that's kind of how I feel whenever I wake up. It's like, oh, I got to stop this. You know, I can't do this anymore. After all the hell has already went by, I've lost, you know, money and everything else. But he says, I saw that I could not take so much as one drink. So he's starting to get a glimpse of it here. I was through forever. Before then, I'd written a lot of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. Notice how now he realizes, he knows how to differentiate the true from the false. Not before, after. So let's look at some of the sweet promises that he wrote. This was found in the family Bible after he had died. When he says he wrote sweet promises to his wife, I just always read that. Thought, okay, that sounds cool. I made a lot of sweet promises to my wife too. But on October 20th of 1928, he wrote this. To my beloved wife who has endured so much, let this stand as evidence of my pledge to you that I have finished with drink forever. Remember the book says, with or without a solemn oath. Some of us do that. On November 22nd of 1928, he says this. He wrote this promise again. My strength is renewed 1,000-fold in my love for you. That's kind of how I am whenever I'm in trouble. I don't know about you guys, but I know about me, and I feel the same way. It's like, so in January of 1929, he writes again, to tell you once more that I'm finished with it forever. I love you. September 3rd of 1930, he writes, finally, and for a lifetime, thank God for your love. So these were the sweet promises that he wrote about, as he talked about right there. There's always history behind these paragraphs, and we don't have time to go into so many of them, but man, there are so many. And there again, if you grab one of those cards, you get into the YouTube part of it, or Spotify. I mean, this is all more in depth, but due to time, we have to do what we do. So anyway, he says, shortly afterward, I come home drunk. Yeah, we always do. There had been no fight. Where was my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way. I'd taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder for such an appalling lack of perspective. And that's the definition of insanity for me, right there. An appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. Well, I would love to go on with this sentence by sentence, but there's no way we can. So let's go to page 6. And we're going to see right here where Bill is really beginning to reach the bottom. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. Anybody relate to that? Courage to do battle's not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity, and I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck. For it was scarcely daylight, and all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My withering nerves were stilled at last. The Mormon paper had told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. Self-pity. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Jim would fix that. So 2 bottles and oblivion. Page 7. My brother-in-law is a physician. This was a man by the name of Leonard Strong. Google Leonard Strong, Alcoholics Anonymous. You'll be able to read about the brother-in-law. I'd love to go into that. We just don't have the time to. And through his kindness and that of my mother, he was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Now, this was the first time that Bill went to Towns Hospital in New York City under the so-called belladonna treatment. Google belladonna treatment. Take a look at that. Beautiful description that doesn't work. But he says my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, now this is where he meets Dr. Silkworth for the very first time. I met a doctor, a kind doctor, who explained, though certain selfish and foolish, I'd been seriously ill. Notice the first word, bodily and mentally. See, Bill had never known that up to this point. He said, it relieved me somewhat to learn in alcoholics that the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of the desperate desire to stop was explained. Bill has knowledge now. He thinks he's good to go. For 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. I went to town regularly, even made a little money. Surely this was the answer. Self-knowledge. Now remember, this is the first time that he sobers up. Now notice the word self-knowledge has a little S in front of self. We're going to want to pay attention to this closely as we go on through the rest of this book. And as I said earlier tonight, I'm not so much interested in self-knowledge, but I'm very interested in knowledge of self, because come to find out, this is what's been killing me. You see, all of these addictions are like the flea. I call self the bug. Those fleas change. Addictions change. Notice when we sober up, some of us get into other things. Some of us fall into lust. Some of us fall into eating a lot. Some of us fall into different stuff, whatever it may be. I need to know that the flea is not the problem. The bug is the problem. Self is the problem. And we're going to look at self as ideas, concepts, attitudes, and false beliefs. We're going to see this when we get to We Agnostics tomorrow very clearly. It's going to tell me, David, you're not suffering from a non-belief in God. Most of us come to believe in God when we were very little. But it hasn't worked for a long, long time. Why? The book's going to tell me that I've lost power. And if I've lost power, who got it? It's going to begin to talk about self. It's going to begin to describe the mental attributes that take place before a relapse. And I'm going to identify with those, and I'm going to start looking at this. What has to change through the process of this work? My thoughts. My thoughts. Over and over and over. Step 10, continue to watch. Continue to watch. Watch your thoughts. Turn your thoughts. Turn your thoughts. Over and over and over. I'm not a big biblical reader, but, you know, the Apostle Paul, he always would talk, turn your thoughts. Turn, turn, turn. You get to lust, he says, hell, flee. Go. You know, I mean, you got to get away from the thought. Because if you don't, the thought will pull us into an action, and I will create a hell. And I'll think it's because I'm a bad person. I don't believe in God. My belief in God is not enough. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with self and a little s. And we're going to see a lot of that as we move through this book tomorrow. So Bill says it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. So his mind had to come back at some point and convince him that it was okay for him to take a drink. He says the curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time, I returned to the hospital, the second time. This was to finish the curtain that seemed to me. Only seemed that way. Doesn't mean that's the way it was. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it'd all end with heart failure during the DTs, or I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year, and she would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. Her and Silkworth were having a conversation outside of the hallway, and he overheard them. He said, if he don't get help, if we don't do something with him, if we don't put him somewhere, he's going to die or he's going to waste away. And Bill says, hell, they didn't need to tell me. I knew, and I almost welcomed that idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. Look at how he's going to talk about self here. I who had thought, key word there. Man, we want to watch for those thoughts. I thought so well of myself. I thought so well of myself for 25 years now, College Anonymous. I'm running all over the place. I'm the man. I help all of you. Come on, let's go, you know. That ain't no good. It ain't good for me to think well about myself. I promise. And my abilities, and he says my capacity to surmount obstacles was cornered at last. He says now was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of thoughts who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. Well, now I'm going to think about it. Yeah, I ain't thought about it before this, but now I'm going to think about it. Man, I can relate to that. There had been much happiness after all. What I would not give to make amends now, but that was over. You see how self convinces us? You can't make amends for what you done, David. You've hurt so many people, especially her. You really think you're going to be forgiven for that? Nah. Just go ahead, big boy. Suck it up because you're going to have to live with it. Now, I don't know about you, but my God's a hell of a lot bigger than that, and I come to find that out. I did. There was a lot of judgment from a lot of people, but I tell you what, there was one that it wasn't from, and that was her. And she walked through that shit with me, and man, it was powerful. Well, let's look at where Bill takes the first step. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. Anybody ever feel like that? I had met my match. I'd been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. So the first time he admitted that he was powerless over alcohol and that his life was unmanageable. Now, the story behind this story, and we're going to read it here. If you come in a desperate condition and you take the first step and we don't move on with any of the rest of this, the same thing that happened to him is going to happen to us. Although we have those oh God moments, they don't last very long for a guy like me. Self always rebuilds itself and comes back and convinces me that it would be okay for me to pull this behavior or that behavior. It may not have anything to do with drinking, but you can bet I'm going to suffer from guilt and shame and remorse over what I've done, and I need something to kill that. I need something to get that off of me. And for me, you know, after years of sobriety, I started turning to other things. You don't have to be free from drugs and alcohol to still be disconnected from power. And my God, what a huge lesson that was for me. So Bill takes step one here. And look at what he says. He says, trembling, I stepped from the hospital, a broken man. Remember back on the last page? He had self-knowledge right there in the middle of the page where it says he relieved me, that very last two words. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. Now he's going to sober on fear. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital, broken man. Fear sobered me a bit. This is the second time. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. And on our Armistice Day in 1934, I was off again. And the story is that he caught a ferry. He was sober, and he was going over to see his brother-in-law. They were going to play golf. And so he gets on that ferry, and he goes across, and he grabs the subway, and he sees a guy that has a shotgun. And Bill knows a hell of a lot about everything. Well, he definitely knows about guns. And so he's sitting there, and, you know, they talk about this gun for a while, and then Bill starts talking to him about being sober and, you know, how we do. And he tells this man his story. So they get off that subway there in New York, and this guy walks into a bar with that gun. Well, no, that wasn't uncommon in those days. Hell, he wasn't there to shoot anybody. You know, he just banged his gun in. Bill goes in with it. So they said, anybody a veteran here? Well, Bill raised his hand. He's a veteran. They said, one free drink on the house for every veteran. Thank you for your service and all you do. Mine says, you better not turn that down. He grabs that drink without even thinking about it, puts it in his mouth, swallows it down into his body. Once he does, the physical allergy takes over. When the physical allergy takes over, the mind says, oh, shit, too late. Bill ends up drunk, never makes it to his brothers. He passes out, ends up back at the house a couple of days later. Anybody other than me relate to Bill? So he says, the insanity of that first drink on our Armistice Day 34, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or I'd stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, this was the beginning of my last debauch. See, he didn't know that. We don't ever know that. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. Now, Bill's going to mention this fourth dimension of existence many times in this book. But this is the only place in the book that he's going to give a definition of what that looks like. And he says it like this. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Why would he put happiness first? Why wouldn't it be usefulness? Why would he put peace there? Instead, it should always be usefulness, right? Well, I can have no happiness or peace, come to find out, until I am useful to somebody else, because that takes me out of self. And when I'm out of self, I'm not thinking about me, I'm thinking about you. And then I begin to start to recover from a hopeless state of mind. So he says here, as time passes, it doesn't end. See, when I drank alcohol, that always ended. I always had happiness for a little while. I even had peace every now and again, and I felt like I was useful from time to time, but I can promise you it never got incredibly more wonderful as time passes. It got worse as time passed. Bottom page. Bill's bad now. He's in a bad way. He says, my musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. This is Ebby Thatcher. I italicize those words. Charlie always said, man, anytime you see those words, pay attention. He was sober. It had been years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. You see, Roland Hazard and the man named Ceper Graves, which we're going to read about, we probably won't have time tonight, showed up where it says 2 men appeared in court. We're going to read about that probably tomorrow. But Bill says right here, rumor had it he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. Well, Ebby had been drunk, and he come from a family that had a lot of money. They were embarrassed by his drinking and the way he behaved. So they told him, they said, why don't you go out there to the old Summit place, which was their home place, and we want you to clean it up while you're out there, paint it, do something with yourself. Hell, get sober. So he goes out there and he starts doing that. He puts all this paint up and down this wall. It's pretty. All these pigeons flew by. And you know what pigeons do? They started dropping. And it got all over that pretty paint on the side of that house. And it pissed him off bad. And he went in the house and got a shotgun. He came out and he just started shooting everywhere. Well, in those days, they could take you to court and lock you up for alcoholic insanity. And that's exactly what they did to him. People called the law and they showed up. And it says right here, rumor had it he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he'd escaped. Of course, we'd have dinner and then I could drink openly with him, unmindful of his welfare. I thought, keyword, remember, we're going to watch for that a lot, only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered the airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility, the very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. So what happens is these 2 men show up and they convince the judge to let him go in their custody. So the old Calvary Mission is where the Oxford groups had their headquarters. And so Ebby's laying there one night, and he knows by now the way to get out of self is to think about helping somebody else. And so he remembers his old friend Bill. And he says, damn, I wonder if I could go see Bill. And so that's exactly what he does. Look at the next sentence. The door opened. There he stood, fresh skin and glowing. There's something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed but curious, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smiling. He said, I've got religion. I'm damn glad that didn't happen to me with T-Bone. I promise you, if he had told me he'd got religion, I wouldn't have been there any longer. Look at what Bill felt the same way. Look at what he says. I was aghast. So that's it. Last summer, he was an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspect a little cracked about religion. I felt that way after coming to a few meetings. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire, right? But bless his heart, let him rant. My gin will last longer than his preaching. But here's the true 12-step. Here's the true 12-step call. He did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court. Remember, this was a man by the name of Roland Hazard and another man by the name of Ceper Graves. Graves, not Graves, Graves. And they persuaded the judge to suspend his commitment. They told him, let him come with us. I think that we can sober him up. We're finding the cure for this. So they take him to the Oxford group, and Ebby gets sober. So they told him of they had told him of a simple religious idea. In those days, that was step 2. And a practical program of action, that's steps 3 through 12. Bill knew 3 things at that point. He knew the problem from Silkworth. Once I put it in my body, I can't stop. He knew the solution from Ebby. Once I take it out of my body, my mind's going to convince me to go back every time. Ebby brought him that. And Ebby brought him the Oxford Group Practical Program of Action, which we'd seen earlier tonight. There were 6 tenets of the Oxford Group. Bill had 3 things. He knew the problem, he knew the solution, he knew the practical program of action, and Bill recovers. Before this story is out, in the next page or 2, Bill recovers from a hopeless state of mind. And it's amazing how this worked. He said that was 2 months ago, and the result was evident. It's self-evident. It worked. He'd come to pass his experience along to me. See, Bill didn't like the simple religious idea at all, no more than most of us did. If I cared to have it, I was shocked, but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. He said he talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. Remember early in his story when I read that out of that book just a little bit ago? This is the experience that he remembers now. It comes back again. Thank God it comes back again. It came back 25 years later, but it came back. It came back, and it did for Bill here. I love what he says. There was that proffered tempered pledge I never signed. Look up proffered tempered pledge. I wish we had time to go into that. We don't. My grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk in their doings is insistent that the Spears really had their music. But I can relate to his grandpa. His grandpa right here says, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past, and they made me swallow hard. Now, the wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral comes back. Bill has another experience right here. Boom. And he's fixing to talk about what happens to him sitting at the kitchen table drinking. Don't tell me that you can't have a spiritual experience drinking. Bullshit. We can. And we do. And he did. We left off last night. Last night we started our study. We kicked it off with the title page. We went through the preface and the first 4 editions. We looked at the doctor's opinion and ended up in Bill's story on page 10. And that's where we'll start today. Like I said last night at the beginning, I do not claim to be a guru of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous by no means whatsoever. And anything I say here, feel free to agree or disagree with. If your sponsor tells you something different than I've said, your sponsor's right, not me. So I just want to throw that out from the beginning. I always like to do that because I was taught how to study the book early on. Later in sobriety, I learned how to practice what was in the book. So those two came together in a good way. And recovery then has grown from there. So we looked at the first 10 pages in Bill's story. We looked at his life. We went over the Winchester Cathedral in a little deeper way. Those of you that wasn't here last night, I have that information. I'd like to share it with you. Ashley has it as well. Today, whenever I get to that part, we're going to be looking in step 2 at some templates of spiritual terms and bedevilments and different stuff like that. Now, we do see where Bill has hit a bottom. From page 8, we looked at step 1, where he took step 1, middle of the page, where it says, trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me a bit. So we see that fear will sober us for a bit, but it won't ever last. It just can't. And we see where his friend from school, Ebby Thatcher, showed up. We went deep into the what happened with, the alcoholic insanity that Ebby had suffered. We went deep into that story. We looked at the history on some of that stuff. We looked at the 2 men who appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend Ebby's commitment. That man was Roland Hazard and Seeper Grays. We will be looking more at Roland Hazard as we move on into the books. But today we're going to start on page 10, and we're going to drop down to the paragraph that says, I had always believed in a power greater than myself. Now, I've heard people say in the rooms, Bill Wilson was an atheist. Bill Wilson was this, it was that. According to that sentence, none of that's true. When we get to we agnostics today, we will see that the definition of an agnostic is someone without knowledge. The word gnostic traces the Latin word all the way back to its roots, which means gnosis, which today means knowledge. So when we put ag in front of any word, it means without. So without knowledge is all that agnostic means. And we see that that's what happened with Bill. He said, I'd always believed in a power greater than myself. I'd often pondered these things. So Bill practiced meditation a long time, according to that sentence. You know, he pondered on those things. He says right here, so if you ever hear this in the room, it's not true. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means, and here's the definition of what an atheist is according to him, and I like it. It's faith in a strange proposition that the universe originated out of a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. So that kind of gives me a bird's eye view that sometimes I have faith in things that are very strange. Anybody else suffer from that other than me? So what I find out when I get to we agnostics is I've had faith all along. It's just been channeled in the wrong direction. What I got to do now is connect it to the power. And when I do that through this process, amazing things begin to happen. So my intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and force at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. How could there be so much precise and immutable law and no intelligence? See, I think this is where Bill, like most of us, got hung up. We rely more on the intellect than we do the spirit. The problem is we think we're relying on spirit. Thinking's messed up. We've talked about that over and over, and we'll look at it deeper today. So look at what he says. I simply had to believe in the spirit of the universe. That's our second step. Who knew neither time nor limitation, but that is as far as I'd gone. With the world's minister and with ministers and world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, whose love was superhuman strength and direction, I became irritated. And look at what he says, my mind snaps against such a theory. He's not talking about his God-centered self. He's talking about his self-centered self. His mind snapped shut against that kind of theory. He said, to Christ, I conceded the certainty of a great man not too closely followed by those who claimed him. Now, I used to beat Christians half to death with that sentence out of this big book. I don't do that so much anymore. I leave them alone. Their belief is their belief, and mine is mine. I have a lot of their beliefs, but not all their beliefs. That's okay. It says, his moral teaching, most excellent. For myself, I'd adopted those parts which seemed most convenient, not too difficult, and the rest I disregarded. Don't a lot of us do that right here in Alcoholics Anonymous? We fall short and wonder why. So he talks about the wars and all, but I want to drop down to the bottom of this, the very bottom, and he's talking about his friend. We're going to see, anytime we see the small f in friend, he's talking about Ebby. When we see the capital F, he's talking about God. So we're going to look at that as we go through this. Bottom of page 11, last sentence. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped new soil. This is what's happened to me since 2019. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. Now, when we see the word in this big book, we're not looking at color. We're talking about prejudged ideas by self that already tell us what something is, how it is, before even looking into what it might mean. And that's what it's going on with Bill. He said the word God, the word God. We're going to look at spiritual terms when we get to we agnostics here in just a little bit. And those terms are very important because sometimes terms will throw my mind in a tailspin. Somebody say something about God or Jesus Christ, I would just go batshit crazy, especially when I was in jail. It's just a term. Just a term. That's all it is. I mean, I've come to learn I can call this whatever I want. Creator, source, love of the universe, whatever. It's just a term. So he said the word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought, keyword, when the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, look at what this thought done to him. And this is what we want to watch for, even being sober. He said this feeling was intensified. We talked about last night, self is not an entity. It's not an entity. It's an activity of the mind. It comes to us in thoughts, feelings, attitudes, outlooks, and beliefs, conceptions, and prejudice. That's how self lives. It lives through us in those ways. And as you read the book, on and on and on, it tells you this is what has to change in order for you to recover. Not to get sober, to recover from a hopeless state of mind. It's very clear to me here that this is what's happening with Bill, and this happens just before he has another one of his spiritual experiences, the big one that most people talk about. He said, I could go for such conceptions. See, self is made up of conceptions as well, as creative, intelligent, universal mind or spirit of nature. But I resisted the thought of the czar of the heaven, however love and its sway may be. I've since talked with scores of men who have felt the same way. So religion says that this is the way that you must believe. Spirituality says it doesn't matter. Do you believe? Second step, we came to believe. That's past tense. We looked at that last night in the forwards. When we answered that question honestly from our heart, do I believe this program can work for me too? And if I answered that from my heart, I came to believe right then. Now we're going to go deeper into that, of course, but we took that belief way back. Bill says that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I'd lived and shivered many years. He is scared of God, like most of us. Anytime that I shiver and that I'm, I stand and I shiver and I'm afraid of God, I'm going to try as best I can to do what I can because I think it's pleasing to God. Well, that's nothing but self. I'm relying on self to give me my understanding of God. That's why so many of us get sick even after being in the rooms for a long time. But look at what Bill said. He said, I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself, just a willingness. Nothing more is required of me to make my beginning. That's not the end, that's the beginning. I saw, now he's starting to have vision. I saw that growth could start from that point up on a foundation of complete willingness. That's step one. I might build what I saw in my friend, little f. He's talking about Abby. Would I have it? Of course I would. So, the foundation of the structure is willingness. Willingness. So let's look at what happened to Bill. He's sitting here drinking, picture it, at the kitchen table with Abby Thatcher, or drinking while Abby is there. Abby's telling him about God, and he's getting mad as hell. He don't want to hear it. He's like, I can go for this conception, I can go for that conception. But Abby says something back up there that changed the course of history, and this had to be God talking through him. Our friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. Why don't you choose your own conception of God? Nobody had ever said that to Bill. Nobody ever said that to me. The churches I went to, they laid out what the conception of God was, and that's the way it had to be. And if it wasn't that way, then I was doomed and I was going to hell. The insanity of it is my mind believed that, and I ran from God. Instead of running to God, I ran from God. And this book and this process brought me back. Let's look at Bill's experience. Thus I was convinced, second paragraph, second to the last paragraph on the bottom of page 12. Thus I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans, key words here, when we want him enough. Bill says, I'm convinced of that now. He wasn't convinced of that earlier, but now he's seeing it different. So let's look at where Bill took his second step. Now, we've seen on page 8 where he took the first step and he drank again. Here's where he took his second step. He said, at long last, I saw, I felt, I believed. That's step 2. Look at how he explains his spiritual experience. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. That's what we're looking for here. We want a new outlook on life. This is more than about just getting sober. So the real significance of my experience at the cathedral burst up on me. There it is again. That came back to him. Remember, we read that. And for those that wasn't here, and if you might not have been here on Zoom, Ashley will be glad to share that with you, and I will be glad to share it with you on this end. He says, for a brief moment, talking about back then and earlier in the story, I had needed and wanted God, and there had been a humble willingness to have him with me. He's watching bullets fly all around him. Planes are flying over, dropping bombs. There's damn sure a humble willingness for God at that point. You know what I mean? Or there has been for me in times of trouble like that. And look at what he says. He came. He always comes, capital H. But soon the sense is blotted out of his presence is blotted out by worldly clamors. We're going to look at that as self as we move on through this book. Self will always come back and rob this experience if we're not watching. Bill says most of those was in myself. And so it had been ever since I've been. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. We know that Bill Wilson never drank again after that day and up until the moment of his death. Treatment seemed wise, where I showed signs of delirium tremens. That was on December 10th of 1934. Look how Bill took the steps and recovered. There I humbly offered myself to God. We know that today to be our third step in Alcoholics Anonymous. As I then understood him, do with me as he would, I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction, and I admitted for the first time that of myself, I was nothing. I like to take my off of self and just call it self. I don't like to associate me with self any longer. I've done that long enough. I am not the self. I am not my thoughts. I am not those thoughts. I'm none of that. He says, let's look at his surrender. I mean, to admit that of myself, I'm nothing, I'm lost, that's a surrender. Let's look at where he took what we know today to be the fourth step in Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, I've ruthlessly faced my sins and become willing to have my newfound. Now look at it, he's talking with a capital F now. He's not talking about Ebby here. He's talking about God. A newfound friend. Take them away root and branch. We know that today to be our sixth and seventh step in Alcoholics Anonymous. I have not had a drink since. My schoolmate visited me and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiency. We know that today to be our fifth step in Alcoholics Anonymous. We made a list of the people I'd hurt, to whom I felt resentment. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrongs. We know that today to be our eighth and ninth step in Alcoholics Anonymous. Never was I to be critical of them. Anybody guilty of that other than me, even sober? Yeah. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Let's look where Bill took what we know today to be the 10th step in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. Let's look at what Bill took today as we know to be the 11th step in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. How often do I do that? Honestly, really. Not very often. I'm guilty of not practicing that 100%, but I have gotten better over the last 4 years. But you have to know that I've been doing it for almost 28 years now, or almost 29 years. So that's a long time. Never was I to pray for myself. How often do I do that? God, help me be a better husband. Help me be a better daddy. Help me be a brother, another brother. It's still all about me. If I look underneath the surface, all those things are good, and I want to be those things in my life today. It's still, that prayer is all about me. So he says, never am I to pray for myself. My Al-Anon mama put it this way. My son was dying from heroin disease about 4 years ago, and he, by the grace of God, he got clean. But I was tore up. I was shaken up, man. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help him, couldn't help him. And I was so pissed off. And this little lady, humble little lady, I just love her, many years in Al-Anon. And I talked to her, and she said, David, I want you to pray to God. I said, I'm not going to do that. And she said, why? And I said, because I'm tired of asking. I've asked him and asked him and asked him and asked him, and ain't nothing happened. She said, why the hell don't you stop asking him for everything, start thinking? Thank you, God, that he's alive today. Thank you, God, that he's got a chance for recovery because of your example, if you'll get a better attitude. Thank you, God, that he might be safe tonight. He's off the street. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. My prayer changed. This right here, never am I to pray for myself. So if I direct my prayers as thank you rather than give me, I promise you I'm going to have a different experience in my prayer life, and I have. Bill says, then only might I expect to receive. Yeah, sure enough, I'm not praying for me anymore. And that'll be in great measure. Well, let's look at where Bill took the 12th step, the first part of it. When you look at that 12th step on the wall, there's two parts. 12 steps says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, try to carry this message to alcoholics. That's part one. Part two is to practice these principles in all of our affairs. This is where he took part one. My friend, now he's back to the small f, so he's talking about Eddie now. My friend promised when these things were done, I'd enter upon a new relationship with my Creator. My God. When that guy presented this to me in 2019 and we read this, I knew that he was telling me the truth when he told me I'd have a new relationship with my Creator, and so it's been. Bill says that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems, not just the drink problem, not just the drug problem, not just the lust, not just the eating, no, all my problems. Belief in the power of God, not just belief in God, belief in the power of God, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order were the essential requirements. So the two things that we must give up to recover here, one is alcohol, drugs, lust, whatever it may be. We have to give that up, no doubt. But the second is most definitely self-centeredness. Why? Because we're going to find out that's the root of our problem. But Bill gives us a bird's eye view of that here. Simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. And it meant destruction of self-centeredness. We must find a way to give that up. I must turn in all things, not a few things, or not just some things that I want to get better at, all things to the Father of the light who presides over us all. So this paragraph here is going to summarize all 12 of those steps that he just talked about. Bill says there was revolution. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals. He's talking about the 12 steps. But the moment I fully accepted them, when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous in 94, they'd always tell you, go back to the root and read page 449, which is acceptance. Acceptance, the answer to all my problems. Well, I can tell you what, T-Bone and Charlie and men like that showed me that acceptance started way further in the front of the book than it ever did in the back of the book. It starts right here. He says, the moment I fully accepted them, these 12 steps. The effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I'd ever known. Man, what a promise. There was utter confidence. I'm not walking around with my head down anymore, afraid to look up at members because of what I've done in 2019. Today I can look a man in the eye in a complete crowd from behind the podium and tell them the truth of what happened to me in 94. And I promise you, I'm not ashamed of that today. Am I proud of it? No. But am I ashamed of it? Hell no. Because it's helped more people around the world today than I could have ever dreamed. When I was laying in that floor dying and begging for relief, I never thought that 6, 8, 10 countries would be represented listening to this message and going through this work is the way that we do it and recovering. And many of them are on that Zoom call today. It's amazing what this does. And this is why. Look at how he explains the rest of his spiritual experience. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. When we get to the 5th step today, we're going to come back to this because this is how we feel if we've thoroughly done that with another person and God. We feel that electrifying feeling. It's just like I'm clean. There's no more secrets. I don't feel dirty inside no more. It's clean. I feel as though the clean wind of the mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. I remember telling T-Bone, man, I wonder when I'm going to have that experience. He said, how'd you get over here today? And I said, I drove. He said, you didn't even have a car when you came to AA. He said, look at how you dressed. You didn't even have no clothes on. He said, you sober today? I said, yeah. He said, you got a family today? I said, yeah. He said, you got a job? I said, yeah. He said, yeah, I wonder when the hell shit's going to start happening for you too. Wow. His impact on me was pretty sudden and profound. You know what I mean? Bill says, for a moment I was alarmed. I called my friend, small f. So he's talking about Ebby here. No, he's talking about syphilis. Excuse me. I called my friend, the doctor, to ask if I were still sane, and he listened in wonder as I talked. Now, this happened around December 14th of 1934. Finally, Silkworth shook his head, saying, something's happened to you, and I don't understand. You can't understand the spiritual experience. I don't care how much knowledge you got. That's beyond human intellect and understanding. But the doctor says you better hang on to it, because anything is better than the way you were. The good doctor now sees many men who have had such experiences. He knows that they are real. We know that Bill stayed sober the rest of his life from this point on. Now, this tells me that self-centeredness, this paragraph coming up tells me that self-centeredness is gone in Bill's life because we do not think like this otherwise. While I lay in the hospital, the thought came, keyword. When I'm thinking about destruction and I'm thinking about craziness and I'm thinking about getting one over on you, I'm thinking from self. When I'm thinking the way he's about to describe, I'm thinking from God. So the process of this work was to shift me more to where I thought more along the lines. I suffer from a lower system of thought called self. I recover from a higher system of thought called God-centeredness. Either way, it's still thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, ideas, concepts, prejudice. This is what has to change in order for me to recover. So Bill says, while I lay in the hospital, the thought came that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. If you read his story in the prior 13 pages, I guarantee he didn't think this way at all. We're on page 14, brother, second to the last paragraph on that page. He says, perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. That's what a spiritual experience looks like right there. My thinking changed. Let's look at where he took step 12, part 2, practicing these principles in all of our affairs. My friend, small f, so he's talking about Ebby, had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles, not just talking about them, not just demonstrating them in all my affairs. For me today, that's in my home life. That's in my work. That's in my family. That's with you brothers and sisters. All my affairs. Particularly, it was imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Anybody I take one-on-one through this work, this is the first thing we go look at right here. And you have to commit. You have to commit to take people through the work exactly the same way that Charlie and these guys taking me through it, and the way that I take others through it and them through it. They have to agree to this sentence, or I won't work with them. It's imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Faith without works is dead. So let's think about that for a minute. Without faith, anything I work at is dead. But anything I work at without faith, that is self-proposition, is self-propulsion. It's like I'm propelled by self, and I've got all this faith, but it's generated in the wrong direction, and I'm running around causing damage and harm to people, and it's not very good. How appallingly true for the alcoholic. And here it is, for if he failed to perfect and enlarge on his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not, and we will not, survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. I've been able to stay sober through a son's death in 1995. I could have never done that prior to this, ever. I've been able to stay sober on things today that would have drove me to drink. Crazy bosses, relationships, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And this is why. I think the one reason that I didn't die from what I was suffering from all those years and bottomed out in 2019, because by the grace of God, I never, ever lost my passion to work with other alcoholics. I never did. Anytime I was asked to come, I came. And I still do that, only now I do it with a different motive, and things are good. So if you did not drink, you'd surely drink again, and if you drank, you'd surely die, and faith would be dead indeed. With us, it is just like that. Well, let's go to the back page, 16. Because of time's sake, we're not going to be able to cover it all like I like doing, but that's okay. Look at what he says there, first full paragraph, page 16. An alcoholic in his cups is an unlovely creature. Our struggles with him are variously strenuous, comic, and tragic. One poor chap committed suicide in my home. Can you imagine? In your home, trying to help the man sober up, and he kills himself. And this is why he done it. He could not, or he would not see our way of life. When we get to how it works, we're going to see that. Those that do not recover are those that cannot or will not completely give themselves to the center program. And Bill talks about it right here. This man could not or would not see our way of life. There is, however, a vast amount of fun about it all. We know that, and we love each other. We have good times together. These guys ride up on their bikes to Oklahoma, man. We party down for the whole weekend. We do ceremonial sweat lodges, and we hang out. We have a hell of a lot of fun, don't we? It's good stuff. And so there's a vast amount of fun about all of this. There really is. I suppose some would be shocked at our seemingly worldliness and levity, but just underneath that, there's dead earnestness. Although we do all of this stuff underneath, you can bet that we're here for one reason, and that's to get sober, to stay sober, and to help others get sober and recover from a hopeless state of mind. Faith has to work 24 hours a day in and through us, or we perish. Most of us feel we need to look no further for utopia. We got it right here with us and now. Each day, my friend, small f, Ebby, Simple talk in our kitchen multiplies itself into a widening circle of peace on earth and goodwill to men. And I like to say today that I am a part of that widening circle, and so are you. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The more we help, the bigger it gets. Good stuff. I love Bill's story, man. When I'm able to see what he's talking about, this story changed. When that man sat down with me in 2019 and said, I will read the book to you up to, we get to inventory, and then you'll start taking action. You're going to read the book with me, really? This is self. I've had Charlie Parmley, for God's sake, and you want to read the book to me? I didn't say this. It's what I'm thinking. And he's like, that's what we're going to do, or I'm not going to do it. And thank God he did, because there was so much that I had missed here. God, it's one thing to know this. It's another thing to practice it, a whole other thing. That ends Bill's story as we see it. Now remember, all of this is still the first step. From the doctor's opinion all the way to page 43 in the Big Book, Alcoholics Anonymous, every bit of that information is step one. There are 86 pages that lay out the directions to the 12 steps in the Big Book. 43 of those are on the first step. Tells you how important that is. So we'll be in step one for a bit.